He got down on one knee in the middle of my grandmother's 85th birthday party. The whole family circled around with their phones already lifted, and asked me to marry him. I didn't say anything right away. The yard was so quiet I could hear the ice machine humming through the kitchen window. That's when he leaned in close, ring still raised for the cameras, smile still frozen in place, and whispered the words only I could hear. Say yes or I'll be humiliated. Not I love you. Not please. A threat dressed up as a proposal in front of 40 people who loved me. I looked at my grandmother's birthday cake melting under the patio lights, at my mother's hopeful face, at his hand still holding that ring steady. And I said the only true thing I had left in me. No. I want to tell you what happened in the 6 months after that single word, because saying no wasn't the hardest part of this story. Living with what came after was. My name doesn't matter much here. What matters is the family I come from, loud, close, the kind that shows up for every birthday, every graduation, every Sunday dinner whether you RSVP or not. My grandmother, Rose, is the center of all of it. She raised 4 kids alone on a waitress's tips after my grandfather passed young, and somehow turned that into 85 years of throwing the loudest, brightest birthday parties on the block, like joy was something you had to practice out loud or it would forget how to show up at all. I met Marcus 4 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was sharp, funny, the kind of charming that made a whole room lean toward him without quite knowing why. He worked at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, climbing toward a partner track that always seemed to be exactly one promotion away. I liked that about him at first, the ambition, the hunger. I didn't yet understand that ambition, when it isn't anchored to anything real, can quietly become the only thing a person actually loves. The first year was good. Genuinely good. He met my family at Sunday dinner within 2 months, charmed my grandmother by fixing her garbage disposal without being asked twice, charmed my mother by remembering small details about her life that even I sometimes forgot to ask about. I remember thinking, this is what people mean when they say someone just fits. I work in brand strategy, which means I spend my professional life noticing patterns other people miss. Why a customer trusts one company and recoils from another, why a tagline lands and a nearly identical one falls flat, why an audience can sense performance inside the first 3 seconds of an ad even when they can't name what tipped them off. It's strange looking back that I could see all of that so clearly in spreadsheets and case studies, and still take 2 full years to see the exact same pattern sitting across the dinner table from me, night after night, dressed up as a person I loved. But somewhere around year 2, I started noticing a pattern I didn't have language for yet. Marcus needed an audience for almost everything good that happened to him. A work win wasn't fully real until it was posted, captioned, liked by the right people. A nice dinner wasn't complete until there was a photo to prove it had happened. I used to tease him about it gently. He'd laugh and say, I just like sharing my life. I believed him mostly because I wanted to, and because believing him was easier than asking what exactly he needed an audience to confirm. I told him early on one of our first real trips together, that if he ever proposed I wanted it small. Just us, somewhere quiet, maybe the lake my own parents got engaged at. The same flat gray water. The same kind of ordinary Tuesday turned into something neither of them would ever forget. I told him I didn't need witnesses to know something was real. He said, of course, whatever you want, and kissed my forehead, and I filed that conversation away like a promise that had already been kept, instead of one that hadn't even been tested yet. I didn't know then that I'd have to remember that conversation word for word, standing in front of my whole family 2 years later, after the question had already been asked the wrong way in front of everyone, with a ring already catching the light from string lights he hadn't put up for me at all. I didn't know how much weight a single offhand promise could carry. 2 years down the line, once it became the only proof I had that he'd once known me better than he was about to act like he did. The job offer came in the spring of our 3rd year together. A creative director role at a growing firm in another city, for hours away, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice in a career like mine. I'd spent 6 years working my way up from an unpaid internship to a job that still didn't fully use what I could do. And suddenly someone was offering me a real seat at a real table, with my name already on the door. I brought it home that night, practically vibrating. Marcus's reaction was the first real crack I let myself see clearly. He didn't ask about the role or the salary or what the actual work would be. His first question was, "So what happens to us?" Not how do we figure this out together. Not even tell me more. Just what happens to us, like my opportunity was a weather event happening to him rather than a door opening for me, one I'd spent 6 years trying to find the key to. We argued for the first time in a way that scared me a little, not because of the volume but because of what surfaced underneath it. He said things like, "I thought we were building something here." As if my considering the offer meant I'd already abandoned a foundation we'd never actually finished pouring. I pointed out that he'd been talking about a possible transfer to his firm's Chicago office for over a year. He didn't have an answer for that. He just went quiet in the specific way he went quiet when he'd lost an argument but wasn't ready to lose it out loud. His family didn't make it easier. His mother had a habit of asking me at every holiday when Marcus was finally going to make it official, like our relationship was a paperwork delay rather than two actual people figuring out two actual lives at two actual different speeds. His father, Gerald, a retired regional sales manager who measured a man's worth almost entirely by his title and his table at the company holiday party, made comments more than once about Marcus needing to lock things down before some other guy did. I was 29 years old, being discussed like inventory at risk of walking off a shelf nobody had bothered to ask if I wanted to be on. I remember one Easter dinner in particular, Gerald leaning back in his chair with a glass of scotch, telling a story about a colleague who'd waited too long and lost his fiancée to a man who knew how to close. Marcus laughed along at the table. I laughed too, a beat behind everyone else, the way you laugh at a joke you're starting to suspect is actually about you. I started feeling the job offer sitting between us like a held breath neither of us would release first. I hadn't said yes to it yet. I hadn't said no either. I just knew with a clarity that genuinely scared me that whatever I decided was going to reveal something true about my relationship that some part of me wasn't fully ready to know yet. My grandmother, when I finally told her about the offer over coffee, asked me only one question. "Does he make you bigger? Or does he make you smaller?" I didn't answer her that day. I think some part of me already knew, and just wasn't ready to say it out loud where it could become real. I changed the subject instead, asked her about her garden, let her tell me for the third time that summer about the tomatoes that wouldn't ripen, grateful for a problem neither of us needed to solve that afternoon. My grandmother's 85th birthday was scheduled for the second Saturday in June, and my mother had been planning it for months the way she plans everything, color-coded spreadsheets, a guest list that somehow kept growing every week, a backyard transformed with rented string lights and 4 different kinds of pie because nobody in our family can agree on just one. It was supposed to be the easy kind of family event. The kind where nothing was required of me except showing up and loving the people already in the room. I had exactly 9 days left to give my answer on the job offer. Marcus knew the deadline. We'd had 2 more conversations about it that month, both circling the same unresolved center without ever actually landing anywhere new. He'd stopped arguing outright and started doing something quieter, and in hindsight far more effective, a kind of soft, constant worry humming underneath everything he said to me, sighs at odd moments, long pauses before answering simple questions, mentioning almost casually how much he'd miss Sunday dinners at my mom's table if I really went through with it. I didn't clock it as strategy at the time. I just felt the weight of it, the way you feel weather coming before you ever actually see the clouds gathering. My mother had asked me, more than once that spring, whether I'd made up my mind about the job, in the careful sideways way she asks things she's afraid of the answer to. I kept telling her I needed more time, which was true, and also a way of not telling her that the real delay wasn't the decision itself, but what the decision would force me to finally admit about the relationship sitting next to it. 2 days before the party, Marcus asked if his parents could come. We'd never combined our families at a gathering that wasn't an official holiday before, and something about the request felt oversized for what it was on paper, but I said yes because saying no to small things still felt harder than it should have back then. And because I genuinely loved my grandmother enough to want everyone who mattered in one room for her, even people who measured worth in titles. The morning of the party, Marcus seemed different. Lighter, almost giddy. Checking his blazer pocket every few minutes like he was patting down a phone that wasn't actually there. I asked what was going on and he said, "Nothing, I'm just excited for your grandma," and smiled in a way that should have told me something, Except I'd spent 3 years learning to read his charm as safety instead of performance, and I didn't yet know how to tell the two apart on sight, not even up close, not even after everything. I remember helping carry trays of deviled eggs out to the backyard, hugging cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas, watching my grandmother light up in her favorite yellow dress, surrounded by people who'd driven hours just for her. For almost 2 hours it really was the easy, uncomplicated day it was supposed to be. I had no idea that somewhere in his blazer pocket sat a ring box, and a plan that had nothing to do with my grandmother's birthday at all, and everything to do with making sure I never got on a plane toward that job. I keep thinking about how ordinary that afternoon felt right up until it wasn't. How you can be standing in the safest, warmest room you know, surrounded by people who have loved you your entire life, and still not see the exact moment someone decides to use that room against you. It happened right after the cake. My uncle had just finished an off-key rendition of Happy Birthday. My grandmother was mid-laugh, wiping frosting off her thumb, and Marcus stood up so suddenly his chair nearly tipped over behind him. He tapped his glass with a fork, the sound cutting clean through 30 conversations at once, and said he had something he wanted to say while everyone he loved most was already in one place, under one string of lights. I felt my stomach drop before my brain caught up to why. He turned to me, and the whole party turned with him, phones already rising into the air on instinct, the way they do now at anything that even smells like a moment worth keeping. He talked for almost 2 minutes about how I changed his life, how my family had become his family, how he couldn't picture a future that didn't have my grandmother's backyard in it every single June. It was a good speech. I want to be honest about that. It might have moved me in a different room on a different day, asked in a different way entirely. I noticed even then, with some small clinical corner of my brain that never quite turns off, that he kept glancing toward the side yard where his father stood with his arms crossed, like he was checking a scoreboard instead of looking at me. Then he got down on one knee, pulled the ring from his blazer pocket, and asked me to marry him, his voice carrying clean across the yard like he'd practiced the distance. 40 people went silent at once. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. My grandmother stopped chewing mid-bite, and I just stood there frozen, not because I was overwhelmed with joy, but because every cell in my body understood, instantly and completely, that this wasn't a question. It was an ambush dressed in a tuxedo jacket, timed to the exact week of my deadline. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of unbearable weather. Somewhere in that silence I thought, absurdly, of my office, of the city 4 hours away, of a version of my life that had nothing to do with any of the 40 faces currently watching me decide. I thought about how strange it was that the biggest decision of my adult life so far was being asked of me in a tuxedo jacket on one knee in front of a half-eaten cake, instead of anywhere quiet enough for me to actually hear myself think. That's when he leaned in, ring still raised toward the sky for whoever was filming, smile never slipping once, and said the words only I could hear, low enough that nobody 3 feet away caught them. Say yes or I'll be humiliated. Not a question anymore. Not even really about me anymore. A demand in the exact flat tone his father used when he talked about closing a deal before someone else could. I looked past him at my grandmother's cake going soft under the patio lights, at my mother's hopeful frozen face, at 4 years of a relationship I genuinely, stubbornly tried to make work. And I heard my grandmother's voice from weeks earlier clear in my head. Does he make you bigger, or does he make you smaller? I knew the answer before I opened my mouth. I said it quietly, but the yard was so silent it carried anyway, all the way to the back fence. No. Just that. No speech. No explanation. The single truest word I'd said out loud in 3 years. For about 3 full seconds nobody moved. Then it was like someone had pulled a pin out of the whole backyard at once. Marcus's face went through something I'd never once seen on him before. Not heartbreak, not even real surprise, but a kind of public-facing panic, the look of a man watching his own stock price crash in real time in front of the one board he actually cared about impressing. He stood up fast, said my name once, low and tight, and I watched him glance, almost involuntarily, toward his father's table before he looked back at me at all. My mother was the first to speak, and what she said wasn't to me. It was to him. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. she told Marcus, her hand finding his arm. Like I was the storm that had ruined his afternoon rather than a person who just told the truth in the only window I'd been given to tell it. My aunt muttered something behind me about how I'd humiliated him in front of his own parents. Someone I never did find out who had been filming the whole cake-cutting moment on their phone and simply never stopped recording. That video was online by Sunday night. Not viral in some massive national way, but viral in the way that matters most when it's your own life. Shared in our extended family group chat in Marcus's office Slack, in the comment sections of 24 mutual friends who all suddenly had opinions about the woman who said no to a man on one knee at his own girlfriend's grandmother's birthday cake. People who'd never met me decided things about my character within 48 hours. People who had met me, who'd eaten dinner at my mother's table 100 times before, suddenly stopped returning my texts altogether. One cousin commented under the video that I'd always thought I was too good for this family, a sentence that had nothing to do with anything I'd actually said or done, but that apparently made sense to enough people that it collected 11 replies agreeing with her by Monday morning. My grandmother was the one exception in that whole house. She found me in the kitchen an hour later, washing serving trays that didn't need washing, just to have something honest to do with my hands. She didn't ask me why I'd said it. She just stood next to me, picked up a towel, dried a tray I'd already dried twice, and said, "I've been to a lot of birthdays in 85 years. That's the first time anyone's ever given me a present I didn't have to pretend to like." I laughed for the first time that whole night, a strange, cracked sound, and she squeezed my shoulder once before going back out to say goodbye to her guests like nothing unusual had happened at all in her own backyard. But that was one ally in a house suddenly full of people grading my behavior against a man's bruised ego. And one ally, even my own grandmother, wasn't quite enough yet to drown out an entire family deciding, almost overnight, that the real victim in this story wore a tuxedo jacket and a ring he hadn't even paid for himself, since I learned later his mother had picked it out and quietly covered half the cost. I lay awake that whole first night replaying the 3 seconds of silence after I said it, trying to decide whether I'd actually done something brave, or just something the entire family was going to spend the next decade describing as my one great unforgivable mistake. Marcus texted for 4 straight days before I agreed to see him. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had ever been to before, neutral ground, the kind of place you choose specifically because you don't want history in the walls listening to what you're about to say out loud. He looked tired in a way that almost made me doubt myself for half a second, before I remembered that exhaustion isn't the same thing as accountability, no matter how similar they can look across a small table. He opened with an apology that didn't actually apologize for anything specific. "I'm sorry it went down like that," he said, which is a sentence that quietly blames an event for happening rather than a person for causing it. I asked him directly why he'd done it in front of everyone, after I told him years earlier clearly exactly what I wanted instead. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup in slow circles on the table, and then he said something that, for all the wrong reasons, was the most honest thing he'd told me in 3 years together. I almost wished, for one strange second, that he'd lied to me instead. A lie I could have just walked away from. The truth meant I had to sit there and actually hear it. "I knew if I asked you quietly, you might actually think about it," he said. "I knew if I asked you in front of everyone, you'd feel like you had to say yes." He said it almost like a confession, but I heard it for what it actually was, a strategy fully formed. He hadn't proposed because he was certain of us. He'd proposed publicly because he was uncertain of us, and he'd wanted an audience to do the convincing his own relationship apparently couldn't manage on its own anymore. I asked him about the job offer point blank, whether the timing had anything to do with my deadline at all. He didn't deny it. He said his father had been in his ear for weeks about how a man either secures things or loses them, that watching me get excited about a city 4 hours away had scared something loose in him. He didn't know how to name except by reaching for the one thing that felt permanent and dramatic enough to compete with it. "I didn't want to lose you to a job," he said. I told him that wasn't romance. That was panic wearing a ring box like a disguise. He tried, toward the end of that conversation, to make it about my family instead of about him, said I'd embarrass myself more than him, said people would forget eventually if I just smoothed it over, Suggested we could quietly get back together in a few months once the dust settled. As if our entire relationship were a PR situation that simply needed better messaging and a longer news cycle to bury it. That was the moment I understood, fully and finally, that even sitting across from the wreckage of what he'd done, his first instinct was still to manage the room instead of actually see me in it. I stood up before my coffee was even half finished and told him I wasn't going to spend one more conversation negotiating my own worth down to something he found convenient to live with. He called after me twice as I walked to my car. Not my name exactly. More like a sound a person makes when a script they clearly rehearsed in the shower that morning stops working halfway through the scene. The 2 weeks after that coffee shop conversation were some of the loneliest of my life, and I say that having lived through plenty of ordinary loneliness before this. My mother still wasn't fully speaking to me the way she used to, careful and clipped on the phone, clearly still operating from the version of events where Marcus was the wounded party, and I was simply the complication that had ruined his big moment. My aunt sent a long text about how things looked to the family, that I read twice and then deleted, because I didn't have the strength that particular week to also carry how things looked to people who hadn't been the one whispered at. I left it unanswered for 3 days, then 4. Watching the read receipt sit there like a small, quiet accusation every time I opened my phone for something else entirely. I started doubting the one thing I'd been completely sure of in that backyard. Maybe I had embarrassed him unnecessarily. Maybe there had been a gentler way to say no that wouldn't have detonated across 2 family group chats and an unknown number of strangers' phones by Monday morning. I caught myself more than once drafting an apology text to Marcus that I never actually sent, full of language that quietly made his humiliation my responsibility to manage, the exact pattern I'd just spent an entire coffee shop conversation refusing to participate in anymore. I thought a lot that week about my mother, and where she'd learned to comfort the man instead of the daughter standing right in front of her. I remembered slowly, piecing it together over several nights, a story she'd told me once about her own engagement, how my father had proposed at her own birthday dinner, in front of his entire side of the family, and she'd said yes immediately, not because she was certain, but because the room was watching, and saying no in that moment had felt, to a 23-year-old version of her, like a kind of violence she didn't yet have the language to commit. She'd built a whole marriage and eventually a divorce 12 years later, on top of a yes that started out exactly the way my own no had almost not happened at all. That realization didn't fix anything that week. I want to be honest about that part too. I still missed Marcus in the specific, confusing way you miss the comfortable pieces of something even after you've clearly seen the rot sitting underneath it. I still flinched every time my phone buzzed, half expecting another relative weighing in on my character from a safe distance. There was one particular night, lying awake well past 2 a.m., when I genuinely wondered if I'd traded a chance at an ordinary, uncomplicated life for some abstract idea of self-respect that almost nobody around me seemed to actually value out loud. I didn't reach an answer that night either. I just lay there in the dark, replaying my grandmother's voice from the kitchen. That's the first time anyone's ever given me a present I didn't have to pretend to like, and held on to it the way you hold a single working flashlight in a house where every other light has gone out at once, all at the same time. I didn't call my grandmother that night to ask her to fix anything. I just needed to know that somewhere out there, one person had watched the whole thing happen and still thought I'd given her a gift instead of a scandal. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I think stories like this one matter precisely because they don't resolve in 48 hours, the way the internet always wants them to. They resolve slowly, in kitchens and coffee shops and 2 a.m. ceilings, and this one was about to take its first real turn towards something true. My sister Olivia called me on a Tuesday, almost 3 weeks after the party. She'd been one of the quieter voices in the family group chat, not defending me outright, but not piling on either, which at the time had felt like its own particular kind of abandonment. She asked if she could come over, and when she did, she didn't apologize right away. She just sat on my couch and said, "I need you to tell me exactly what he whispered to you. Word for word. Because Mom told me a version, and something about it never sat right with me, not once." I told her. All of it. The job offer, the deadline, his father's comments about men who lock things down. The exact 6 words, "Say yes or I'll be humiliated." that had been quietly edited out of the family's retelling somewhere between the backyard and the group chat. Olivia went very still when I finished. Then she said, "Nobody told me that part." She left an hour later, and within a day, she'd repeated those same 6 words to our mother, in the same order, without softening a single one of them for anyone's comfort. Olivia told me afterward that our mother had gone quiet on the phone for almost 10 full seconds, which, if you know our mother, is roughly the conversational equivalent of an earthquake. My mother called me that night, and for the first time in 3 weeks she didn't open the conversation with anything about Marcus at all. She said, "I think I heard what I wanted to hear instead of what actually happened." It wasn't a perfect apology. She still gently suggested I could have found a kinder way to say it in the moment, and some old tired part of me almost let that comment slide the way I'd let 100 others slide before it. But I didn't this time. I told her there's no kind way to say no to a threat, only a clear one, and she went quiet for a moment before she said, "You're right. I'm sorry it took me this long to actually ask." That same week, I called the company back and accepted the job. 4 hours away, a real seat at a real table, a life that was going to be entirely uncomplicatedly mine to build from the ground up. I didn't make the decision because of anything Marcus had done to me. I made it because I finally understood that the question I'd been avoiding for months, "Does he make you bigger or does he make you smaller?" had already been answered for me in front of 40 people, by a man who needed an audience just to ask me something that should have only ever needed the 2 of us in a quiet room. I called my grandmother before I called anyone else to tell her. She didn't say congratulations. She just said, "Good. Go be big somewhere they can't shrink you." And that, more than any toast or speech I'd ever heard at any engagement party, is the sentence I still carry around in my chest like a second heartbeat. I moved 4 hours away at the end of that summer, into a small apartment with bad water pressure, and the best afternoon light I've ever had in a kitchen. Marcus reached out twice more over the following months, once with an apology that sounded almost real, once with an update about a promotion he'd finally gotten, like I was still on the list of people whose approval mattered to his scoreboard somehow. I didn't respond to either message. Some doors close more gently when you simply let them, instead of explaining the lock to someone one more time for free. My grandmother turned 86 this past June. A smaller party this time, just close family. No string lights rented for an audience that never needed to be there in the first place. She hugged me extra long when I arrived and whispered, "No ring boxes this year, I hope?" And we both laughed until my mother told us to behave ourselves in front of the cake. My mother and I are different now, better in the slow, unglamorous way most repaired things tend to be. She asks more questions before she forms opinions these days, and I've gotten braver about answering honestly, even when the honest answer is complicated and doesn't make anyone comfortable. I think about that backyard sometimes, the silence after I said no, the particular weight of 40 people deciding in real time whose pain mattered more that afternoon. I don't regret the word. I regret, a little, how long it took me to understand that a love which needs witnesses to function isn't actually asking you a question at all. It's asking the room for permission to keep being the main character of a story that was supposed to belong to both of you equally. Some nights, in my new apartment with the good light and the bad water pressure, I still catch myself rehearsing what I'd say if he ever showed up at my door unannounced. I haven't needed the speech yet. I have a feeling I never will, and for the first time in a long time that doesn't feel like a loss. If this story found something true in you tonight, do me a favor. Follow this channel, and if you can, send it to 5 people who might need to hear it the way you did. Leave an honest comment below. Tell me about a time you said no to something everyone else around you expected you to say yes to. And tell me what story you'd like to hear next, because these stories only mean something if we keep telling them together. I'll see you in the next one.